The Ottoman Empire was once the terror of Europe, a multi-continental superpower that commanded the trade routes between East and West, yet its ultimate demise was not written in blood on a battlefield, but in ink on a high-interest loan agreement in the mahogany row offices of London and Paris. This is the story of the Ottoman debt trap, a calculated financial assassination that saw a centuries-old empire dismantled by bankers without a single shot being fired, proving that a sovereign nation can be conquered more effectively through compound interest than through military invasion. While the Sultan's janissaries were feared for their courage, they were ultimately powerless against the invisible, relentless force of Western capital that turned the sick man of Europe into a financial slave of the very nations it once threatened. This was a $500 billion heist in today's currency, a masterclass in colonial banking that lured the Ottoman leadership into a spiral of debt from which there was no escape, transforming the Middle East into a collection of collateral for Western bondholders. The trap was set in 1854 during the Crimean War, when the Ottoman Empire, desperate for cash to modernize its military and fight the Russian threat, took its first external loan from British and French financiers. This moment was the financial point of no return. The Ottomans, unfamiliar with the aggressive nature of Western industrial finance, agreed to terms that were predatory from the start. High interest rates combined with massive issuance fees meant that the empire received only a fraction of the actual loan amount while being responsible for repaying the full face value. For the Sultan, this seemed like a temporary necessity, but for the bankers, it was the first link in a chain. How could an empire that controlled the world's most strategic geography become so desperate for cash that it signed away its future for a fraction of its value? This initial loan created a dependency that the Kremlin or the Habsburgs would have recognized, a need for the next loan just to pay the interest on the first. This financial decay was accelerated by the Sultan's obsession with symbolic grandeur over structural reform. Instead of investing the borrowed millions into industry or infrastructure that could generate revenue, a significant portion of the loans was squandered on extravagant palaces like Dolmabahce and the maintenance of a bloated, inefficient imperial bureaucracy. This created a lethal economic mismatch. The empire was importing Western debt to fund non-productive consumption, while its domestic manufacturing was being decimated by cheap, machine-made European goods that flooded the Ottoman markets under capitulations or forced trade treaties. The Ottoman economy was effectively being hollowed out, its gold flowing back to Europe to pay for the debt and the luxury goods, leaving the domestic treasury in a state of permanent cardiac arrest. The situation reached a boiling point in 1875, a year known in financial history as the Ottoman default. After 20 years of continuous borrowing, the empire's debt service, the mere payment of interest, consumed more than half of its total annual revenue. When a global financial panic hit, the Sultan realized the impossible. He could no longer find anyone willing to lend him the money to pay the interest on his existing loans. The empire was officially bankrupt. This was not just a financial failure, it was a geopolitical catastrophe that gave the Western powers the legal right to intervene directly in Ottoman internal affairs to protect their bondholders. What happens to a superpower when it can no longer pay the people who own its debt? The answer was the creation of a shadow government that would effectively rule the empire's finances for the next 40 years. The most shocking element of this trap was the Decree of Muharrem in 1881, which established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, OPDA. This was a body of foreign creditors who were given absolute control over the most lucrative parts of the Ottoman tax system. They didn't just advise the Sultan, they literally seized the empire's revenue streams. The taxes on tobacco, salt, spirits, and silk were collected directly by foreign officials and sent to Europe to pay off the debt. The OPDA became a state within a state, employing more people than the Ottoman Ministry of Finance itself. This was the ultimate realization of the debt trap. The Sultan still sat on his throne, but the bankers owned the keys to his treasury, turning the Ottoman sovereign into a mere figurehead in his own land. The financial pressure of the debt trap directly fueled the ethnic and regional tensions that would eventually tear the empire apart. To satisfy the demands of the OPDA and the foreign bankers, the Ottoman state was forced to squeeze its remaining subjects with increasingly brutal taxation, particularly in the Balkans and the Arab provinces. This economic suffering was the primary driver of the nationalist uprisings that the Western powers then used as a pretext for further military and diplomatic intervention. The debt was the engine of the empire's fragmentation, proving that when a state loses control of its money, it inevitably loses control of its borders. This raises the most terrifying question of all. Did the bankers deliberately lure the Sultan into bankruptcy specifically to trigger the collapse of the empire and the division of the Middle East? The evidence in the secret correspondences of 19th-century financiers suggests a calculated strategy that transformed the Middle East from a sovereign power into a series of debt colonies for the European banking elite. The creation of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration was not just a financial arrangement, but a total surrender of national sovereignty that turned the empire into a laboratory for a new kind of financial colonialism. The foreign commissioners who sat in Istanbul were not there to help the Sultan recover his footing. They were there to ensure that every single piastre of profit from the empire's most valuable resources flowed directly into the vaults of the Rothschilds, the Pereiras, and the Barings in Europe. This shadow government controlled the collection of taxes on tobacco, salt, alcohol, fisheries, and silk, effectively creating a dual state where the Ottoman government handled the expenses of war and administration while the European bankers handled the income. The efficiency of the OPDA was a cruel irony for the Ottoman people, as the foreign-run tax collection was far more effective than the Sultan's own bureaucracy ever was, meaning that the Ottoman peasant was squeezed harder than ever before, not for his own country's defense, but to pay for the high-interest loans that had been squandered on marble palaces and failing military reforms. The sheer scale of this extraction was staggering, with thousands of foreign employees and local agents enforcing a tax regime that prioritizes debt service over human survival, leading to the question, was there a secret plan within the OPDA to deliberately keep the Ottoman economy in a state of primitive stagnation to prevent it from ever competing with Western industries? The structural evidence suggests that the OPDA actively discouraged any Ottoman industrial projects that might threaten European exports, ensuring that the empire remained a captive market for Western goods. The financial trap was further tightened by the Berlin Congress of 1878, where the European powers, acting as both judges and creditors, began to physically carve up Ottoman territory under the guise of diplomatic stabilization. However, the true motive behind the territorial losses in the Balkans and North Africa was often tied to the debt. The loss of tax-paying provinces made it even harder for the remaining Ottoman state to cover its interest payments, leading to more loans and more concessions. Each territorial loss was a double blow. It reduced the empire's revenue base while increasing the relative weight of the debt burden on the remaining territories, particularly the Arab heartlands. This created a vicious cycle of shrinkage, where the state became smaller and more indebted every year, a financial death spiral that made the eventual total collapse inevitable. The Sultan was forced to watch as his empire was sold off piece by piece, not just for land, but to pay for the service of a debt that was mathematically impossible to ever fully discharge. This desperation for cash led to the disastrous sale of the Suez Canal shares by the Khedive of Egypt, an Ottoman vassal, to the British government. This transaction, often celebrated as a brilliant move by Disraeli, was actually a brutal exploitation of financial distress. The Khedive, drowning in debts he had incurred to modernize Egypt and build the canal, was forced to sell his 44% stake for a fraction of its future value just to avoid immediate bankruptcy. This sale didn't just transfer shares, it transferred geopolitical control of the world's most important maritime shortcut to the British Empire. It was the ultimate debt for equity swap, where a strategic global asset was seized by a creditor because the debtor could no longer pay. This loss of the Suez Canal was a fatal blow to Ottoman influence in the region, proving that in the 19th century, a banker's ledger was far more dangerous than a general's bayonet. How many other strategic Ottoman assets were secretly mortgaged to Western banks during this period of decline? The records of the Imperial Ottoman Bank, which was itself controlled by British and French capital, reveal a web of mortgages and liens that covered everything from railways to harbor rights. The role of the Imperial Ottoman Bank, BIO itself, was a masterpiece of financial subversion. Despite its name, the bank was a private institution owned by British and French investors, and it held the exclusive right to issue Ottoman currency and act as the state's treasurer. This meant that the Ottoman government did not even control its own money supply. The very heart of the empire's financial system was owned and operated by its primary creditors. The BIO could manipulate the exchange rate of the Ottoman lira to favor European trade, and could refuse short-term credit to the Sultan at critical moments, effectively holding the state's daily operations hostage to the whims of the London and Paris markets. This was the first time in history that a major world power had completely outsourced its central banking to foreign private interests, a decision that cemented the empire's status as a financial colony. The internal social consequence of this debt trap was the rise of the Young Turks and other revolutionary movements, who saw the Sultan not as a defender of the faith, but as a puppet of Western financiers. Their anger was fueled by the visible reality of the OPDA and the foreign controllers who lived in luxury, while the Ottoman soldier went unpaid and the peasant faced famine. The revolution of 1908 was, at its core, an anti-debt revolt, a desperate attempt by the younger generation of officers and bureaucrats to seize control of the state and stop the financial bleeding. However, once they took power, they discovered the terrifying reality. The debt was so large and the legal agreements so binding that even a revolutionary government could not escape. They found themselves forced to continue the payments to avoid a total European military occupation, proving that a debt trap is a prison with no doors, even for those who overthrow the jailer. The most manipulative part of the banker's strategy was the linked loan system, where any new loan provided to the Ottomans was strictly tied to the purchase of European military equipment or the granting of railway concessions to European companies. The money never truly reached Istanbul. It was simply transferred from one European bank account to a European arms manufacturer or construction firm, while the Ottoman Empire was left with the bill, the interest, and the outdated equipment. This ensured that the Ottoman debt served as a direct subsidy for European industry, a perfect colonial loop where the debtor pays for the creditor's own industrial growth. Did the Ottoman leadership realize they were essentially paying for their own colonization, or were they so blinded by the need for immediate survival that they ignored the obvious trap? The personal diaries of Ottoman ministers show a sense of utter hopelessness, a realization that they were caught in a machine they could no longer control. This financial enslavement set the stage for the empire's disastrous entry into World War I. Desperate to find a way to cancel the debt and reclaim their sovereignty, the Young Turk government believed that siding with Germany, a nation that offered a different kind of alliance, might provide the leverage needed to break the British and French financial chains. It was a final, desperate gamble to achieve financial independence through total war. The entry of the Ottoman Empire into the First World War was not merely a military decision, but a violent, terminal attempt to achieve financial emancipation from the strangulating grip of British and French capital, a desperate move by the Young Turks to unilaterally declare the death of the debt trap and reclaim the resources of the Middle East. One of their first, most radical acts upon entering the war was the unilateral abolition of the capitulations, the centuries-old legal and financial privileges that allowed European merchants and bankers to operate within the empire tax-free and outside the jurisdiction of Ottoman courts. By tearing up these treaties, the Ottoman leadership was attempting to perform a forced financial reset, seizing back the revenue streams controlled by the OPDA and ending the humiliating state within a state that had paralyzed their treasury for decades. However, this move, while bold, was financed by a new and equally dangerous master, Imperial Germany. The German Empire provided the Ottomans with massive gold shipments and military credits to sustain the war effort, essentially replacing one debt trap with another, albeit one that promised a share of a new, German-led world order. This transition from a British-French debtor to a German military client proved that the empire was incapable of surviving as an independent financial entity, as it lacked the industrial base to fund a modern total war without external life support. The war was effectively a liquidation auction for the remnants of Ottoman power, where the cost of resistance was paid for in German gold that the Sultan could never hope to repay if the Central Powers lost. The financial cost of the war itself was the final nail in the coffin for the Ottoman economy, as the state was forced to resort to uncontrolled currency printing to pay its millions of soldiers and maintain its crumbling logistics, leading to a catastrophic collapse of the Ottoman lira. Inflation skyrocketed, making the cost of basic food and fuel unreachable for the urban population, leading to widespread famine and social disintegration in cities like Istanbul, Beirut, and Damascus. The gold that arrived from Germany was quickly hoarded by the military or used to pay for German-made weapons, while the average citizen was left with worthless paper money that merchants refused to accept. This domestic financial collapse destroyed the last vestiges of trust in the Ottoman state, turning the population against a government that could no longer provide either victory or bread. How did the Western bankers react when they realized their multi-billion-dollar investment in the Ottoman debt was being wiped out by the war? Behind the front lines, secret negotiations were already taking place among the Allied powers to ensure that even in the event of an Ottoman defeat, the debt would not be forgiven, but would be redistributed among the successor states, ensuring the bankers would get their pound of flesh from the ruins of the Middle East. The most cynical financial maneuver of the war's end was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which, while often viewed as a purely political map-making exercise, was deeply rooted in the need to secure the assets that served as collateral for the Ottoman debt. The division of the Middle East into British and French mandates was meticulously designed to ensure that the most valuable oil-producing regions and trade hubs came under the direct control of the creditor nations. The mandate system was effectively a financial receivership on a continental scale, where the victorious powers took control of the land to ensure that the wealth of the region, particularly the newly discovered petroleum, could be used to service the old Ottoman debts and fund the reconstruction of Europe. The Arab world was not being liberated. It was being reorganized to facilitate the orderly extraction of resources to pay for a century of high-interest loans. This was the ultimate victory of the debt trap. Even after the empire was dead and buried, its debts lived on, shackling the emerging nations of the Middle East to European financial institutions for generations. The true scale of the financial betrayal was revealed at the Treaty of Lausanne, where the new Republic of Turkey was forced to accept a significant portion of the old Ottoman debt as the price for its recognition as a sovereign state. While Mustafa Kemal Ataturk successfully fought for political independence, the financial ghost of the Sultan's debt continued to haunt the new republic, requiring decades of painful repayments that drained the resources needed for modernization. This ensured that even a revolutionary, secular Turkey remained financially cautious and tied to the global banking system, proving that while you can change the flag and the government, the ledger of the bankers is the most difficult thing to overthrow. What happened to the Arab nations that were separated from the empire? They were saddled with their proportionate share of the Ottoman debt, which the British and French Mandate authorities used as a justification for maintaining their colonial grip, claiming that these new nations were too indebted to be granted immediate independence. The debt trap had successfully transformed from an imperial cage into a colonial anchor, ensuring that the Middle East remained a primary source of interest payments for the banks of London and Paris well into the 20th century. The Ottoman experience stands as the ultimate warning of the debt-to-death pipeline, where a nation's desire for rapid, subsidized modernization leads to a permanent loss of sovereignty. The Sultans believed they could use Western money to buy Western power, but they failed to realize that the money was the power, and it was used to dismantle their empire from the inside out. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration remains history's most blatant example of a private financial entity usurping the functions of a sovereign state, a precedent that continues to inform modern debates about national debt and international financial control. The $500 billion mistake was not just about the money spent. It was about the loss of the future, as the wealth of generations was mortgaged to pay for the fleeting prestige of a dying regime. The financial autopsy of the Ottoman Empire is now complete, showing how the ledger was more powerful than the sword in the destruction of a superpower. We must now prepare for the final summary of the banker's triumph and the lasting scars this financial conquest left on the modern map of the Middle East. The aftermath of the Ottoman collapse revealed a chilling financial reality. The empire had been effectively liquidated by its creditors long before the final peace treaties were signed, and the mandate system established by the League of Nations was nothing more than a formalization of this long-standing financial receivership. When the British and French authorities took control of Iraq, Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon, they didn't just inherit territory. They inherited a massive, meticulously documented portfolio of Ottoman debts that they intended to collect from the very populations they claimed to be guiding toward independence. This meant that the newly formed Arab states were born in a state of inherited bankruptcy, their future revenues already pledged to European bondholders through the complex accounting of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This financial burden was the invisible wall that prevented these nations from developing their own industries or social services, as every spare penny of tax revenue was funneled back to London and Paris. The OPDA did not simply disappear after 1918. It continued to function in a modified form, managing the distribution of the Ottoman legacy debt among the successor states, proving that the ledger of the bankers was more durable than the borders of any empire. The most profound and lasting consequence of this debt trap was the loss of the region's natural resource sovereignty, specifically regarding the vast, untapped oil reserves that were just beginning to be discovered. The Western powers used the excuse of the unpaid Ottoman debt to secure exclusive, long-term oil concessions for their own national companies, such as the Turkish Petroleum Company, later the Iraq Petroleum Company. These contracts, often signed under extreme political and financial pressure by the mandate governments, ensured that the lion's share of the profit from the Middle East's black gold would stay in Western hands for nearly a century. This was the ultimate realization of the bankers' long game. They used 19th century loans for palaces and military parades to seize 20th century energy reserves that would power the global economy. The debt trap had successfully transformed a dying land-based empire into a series of petroleum-producing debt colonies, a transition that defined the geopolitical landscape of the modern Middle East and set the stage for decades of future conflict over resource control. This raises a dark question that historians still debate. Was the entire First World War in the Middle East actually a violent debt collection operation disguised as a war for liberation? When you follow the money, the movements of the British and French armies perfectly align with the locations of the key assets, railways, ports, and oil fields, that served as collateral for the Sultan's loans. The liberation of the Arab people from Ottoman tyranny provided a convenient moral cover for the cold, calculated seizure of these assets by the creditor nations. The sick man of Europe was not just allowed to die, he was systematically dissected to ensure that every organ of value was preserved for the benefit of the European banking houses. This financial autopsy was so thorough that even the personal properties of the Ottoman royal family were confiscated and used to settle state debts, leaving the former rulers as impoverished exiles while the bankers grew wealthier on the interest of a war they had effectively financed on both sides. The systemic destruction of the Ottoman currency and the subsequent imposition of the British pound and French franc in the mandates further cemented the region's financial dependence. By controlling the money supply, the mandatory powers could manipulate the local economies to favor their own exports and prevent any internal industrialization that might compete with Europe. The Middle East was forced into a state of manufactured underdevelopment, where it exported raw materials and imported finished goods, exactly the same trade imbalance that had bankrupted the Sultan decades earlier. This ensured that the region remained a captive market, its people working to pay off debts they never signed for, to a banking system they didn't understand. The debt trap was not just an event in Ottoman history, it was the foundation of the modern Middle Eastern economic order, a system designed to ensure that the wealth of the East always flowed toward the West. The ultimate lesson of the Ottoman debt trap is that financial vulnerability is the precursor to political annihilation. The Sultans believed they could borrow their way to modernity, but they instead borrowed their way to extinction. They traded their sovereignty for a temporary illusion of power, failing to realize that once a nation loses control of its treasury, it is only a matter of time before it loses control of its land. The OPDA remains the most potent symbol of this loss, a private, foreign bureaucracy that literally owned the taxes of a superpower. The final cold reality of the Ottoman debt trap is that it never truly ended. It simply mutated into the modern global financial architecture that governs the Middle East to this day. When the Republic of Turkey finally paid off the last installment of the Ottoman debt in 1954, exactly 100 years after the first loan was taken, the world had already moved into a new era of financial control, yet the scars of that initial century of debt remained etched into the borders and economies of every nation from the Balkans to the Persian Gulf. The $500 billion mistake was not just a historical event. It was a fundamental shift in how power is exercised, proving that you do not need to occupy a nation's capital to control its destiny if you already occupy its central bank. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration served as the blueprint for modern international financial oversight, demonstrating that a shadow government of creditors can effectively manage the resources of a sovereign state more efficiently than its own leaders. This legacy of financial interventionism ensured that the Middle East remained a region where decisions are often made according to the needs of international bondholders and energy markets, rather than the needs of its own people, a direct continuation of the 19th century debt trap under a different name. The ultimate tragedy of the Sultans was their belief that Western technology and military hardware could be purchased with Western loans without also importing Western political and financial control. They viewed the money as a tool for modernization, but the bankers viewed the money as a tool for liquidation. By the time the Ottoman leadership realized that the interest payments were consuming the very empire they were trying to save, it was already too late. The legal and financial chains were too thick to break without total war. This serves as a timeless warning for any modern state that relies on high-interest external debt to fund its national ambitions. The lender's primary interest is not your development, but your collateral. The Ottoman Empire did not fall to a superior ideology or a more courageous army. It fell to a more sophisticated accounting system, one that prioritized the orderly extraction of wealth over the survival of a civilization. The Middle East we see today, divided, resource-focused, and often financially dependent, is the direct result of this $500 billion financial assassination. The history of the sick man of Europe is therefore not a story of inevitable decline, but a story of a calculated financial killing. The bankers of the 19th century identified the empire's strategic assets and used the debt trap to systematically seize them, proving that the most effective way to destroy a superpower is to make it your debtor. This financial autopsy is now complete, revealing that the true winner of the First World War in the Middle East was not a nation, but a global financial system that secured the world's most valuable resources through the cold, relentless logic of a ledger. The Ottoman lira fell, the Sultan fled, and the empire vanished. But the debts remained, a permanent monument to the day a superpower was sold for a fraction of its value. This investigation has proved definitively that the fall of the Ottoman Empire was a financial execution carried out through compound interest and debt traps. The superpowers of the 19th century were not just nations. They were banking houses with the power to buy and sell entire civilizations. The financial details of this story are now fully revealed, but the final judgment rests with you. What do you think? Was the fall of the Ottoman Empire an inevitable consequence of bad leadership? Or was it a masterpiece of financial warfare designed to carve up the Middle East for Western banks? Comment below and share your thoughts on the most significant debt trap in human history.